Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ground Rules Employment Law over your coffee break. My name is Pam Howland, and I'm here today with Jennifer Walrath and Doug Class. We are talking about one of the most exciting issues ever, which is handbooks. Yay! And we were laughing before we hopped on this session because we were saying not the sexiest topic, but from our perspective, one of the most important ones that you should be thinking about for sure. And we're talking about that today because I would argue that in changing times and volatile times and uncertain times, it's more important than ever that you make sure you have got a good handbook in place. 2024, you've heard us say, so full of changes. The law was changing. New laws, new issues employers need to be thinking about. 2025 is going to be even more. When it comes to your policies, there are some new laws you need to be thinking about. And those are largely ones that popped up last year and even in late 2023. We're going to talk a little bit about those, but we're also going to talk about why you need a handbook and why it's so important and what we see go wrong when employers don't have it. And today is your reminder that as part of getting your house in order in 2025, it's time to get the handbook out, get the policies in place, and make sure that the people who are charged with enforcing those policies know that you have a handbook, right? How many times do we talk to supervisors when they don't even know what's in your handbook? These are the people who are supposed to be enforcing the policies, making sure that their employees are in compliance, and they've never even read the handbook. So today we're going to be talking about all of those issues. And again, take advantage of this today to go back to the workplace and make sure that you've got your handbook updated and that the people who need to know about it. So before we jump in and maybe touch on a few policies you should be thinking about, I'm going to turn it over to Jen and Doug to see what they're thinking about, generally speaking, handbooks and the importance of those as we dive in here today.
I guess my first thought is kind of like Pam said, it's very easy for a lot of employers to maybe you have a handbook, but it's sitting on a shelf in a corner somewhere and hardly anyone ever looks at it or opens it, forget they even have it. And you might have a situation come up where you're saying, oh, I'm having performance issues with this employee, or this employee keeps coming late to work and I don't know what to do about it. More often than not, the answer to that question probably is in your handbook, right? If you're a supervisor, that's where you can go. So it's a really useful tool on the day to day, I would say, in terms of managing your workforce. So use it, right? Have an updated one. It can be a roadmap for supervisors, especially newer supervisors, as to how they can approach things like performance and discipline with their employees. And then fast forward, right? If you end up having something that happens in the workplace that becomes a claim, when someone like us gets involved, your handbook is a really important tool then as well, because you can say, hey, you know what? We did what we were supposed to do with this employee, right? We followed our policies. We have good policies. And it ends up generating and truly being, because it's all true and accurate, right? A good defense for whatever happened if you find yourself having to deal with a claim down the road. So I would say it's useful for more than one purpose. It's useful truly day to day in managing your workforce, but also if you end up having to deal with some sort of legal claim or legal issue, it's helpful then as well.
And it really helps your employees as well, right? It really helps them to understand kind of what's expected of them, what the procedures will be if there's any problems, and where they can go for help. So I think it takes uncertainty out of the workplace, and it takes kind of the arbitrary nature of things out, and it gives everybody a guide that can help navigate employment. And I just think that it's kind of essential thing, and kind of free forming it doesn't get you where you need to get. We were talking about a minute ago. When you start a business, you have a business plan. When you have employees, you need a handbook. It's really kind of one of those basic things.
Yeah. So, as they both touched on, if you have a problem, if you have a claim or a lawsuit, this becomes Exhibit A to your defense. It shows you know the law, you're complying with the law, but it's a lot bigger than that. It's a very practical tool, helps you manage your employees, helps you be better managers, right? If your employees aren't following the policies, it's a tool for performance management to help them become better at what they're doing. I would add that it's a great tool for building culture as well. If you have specific rules, policies that you want enforced that are key to your culture, your core values, the handbook is yet one more tool that helps you get there. So let's talk a little bit about some of the policies that may not be in your current handbook, but probably should be. We've got a number of those. We can keep a running tally over here as to what should be going in these handbooks. I'm going to kick it off by saying that as we've watched what's happening in the world right now, I would say maybe your respectful workplace policy, in making sure that employees are engaging in professional, respectful conduct, that might be a key one to make sure you've got in place right now. We see it as a standalone policy. We see it as part of the code of conduct. I don't know that it matters so much where it lands in your handbook, but what we're hearing from HR professionals right now is that workplaces have more tension than ever right now because of the political scene out there, and that there's a general sense of distrust. Maybe employees who are politically aligned one way, thinking others are politically aligned another way. And that is creating tension and disrespect. And we know that if those go unchecked, it's going to lead to claims of discrimination and harassment. So that is one policy I would say right now you should be making sure you got in your handbook if you don't already have it.
I'll add on that. I mean, it's in some ways kind of an easy add, but that's the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is, focused on accommodating workers who are pregnant or have experienced pregnancy or childbirth or are dealing with a condition related to pregnancy or childbirth. But I'm going to go a little bit broader than that even, and just say generally to kind of do a refresh and make sure you've got all of your policies for accommodations writ large. Disability accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, accommodations under the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which, is pretty new law. It was passed in 2023 and implementing regulations were put in place last year. And then also religious accommodations. That's another type of accommodation. And you want to make sure that all of your employees understand that they have the ability to get accommodations of those varying kinds, where and how they should go to, inquire about that or ask for accommodations. Because you as the employer want to know when someone believes they need something like that so that you can walk through the appropriate process and figure out what to do. And then you also want to make sure employees who, are in need of that, they can't say later, I didn't know how to do it, but also you just want them to know so that they can go and get the help that they would need to be able to stay in the workplace.
And so you know how to help them too, right? So that's the really important thing. This is a tool for your supervisors to say, "Oh gosh, this is how I deal with this situation." Yeah, I think there's a lot. I mean, you can put endless amount of policies, but I think it's important to have the ones that are required by law. Equal employment and opportunity discrimination, harassment policies. It's really important to have things like wage and hour policies, paid time off policies, all that sort of thing, because a lot of times we talk to employers and they're like, well, we don't know what happens to their paid time off if they get fired. Well, you should think about it. You should have that in the handbook beforehand, because otherwise, at the end of the employment relationship or during it, there'll be disagreement. It won't be clear. It's just a place to make everything very, very clear. We were talking a couple of weeks ago on this podcast about relationships among employees. That's definitely something you want to consider in your handbook. Consider not whether or not you want a policy regarding that, especially involving supervisors and subordinates. These are areas where you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if it's not clear how the business is going to operate.
So this topic, like we said, maybe not juicy, but okay, we have a lot to say about this. So just touching on what Jennifer and Doug just said. So did you know that recently the United States Supreme Court changed somewhat the standard to prove a religious accommodation case? So religious accommodation claims are now easier in some respects for employees to bring. That's kind of what Jennifer was touching on. So check out the accommodation policy. Make sure you've got one. Make sure it addresses not just ADA, but ADA, Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, religious accommodations. She also touched on your anti-discrimination policy. So Doug, remember in one of our recent podcasts, we were talking about how the EEOC is now going after employers who aren't investigating quickly enough and who don't have adequate protocols and processes in place for when a report comes in. So one more reason, you need to make sure not just that you've got an anti-harassment, anti-discrimination policy, but that it's got the key elements to it. And how do you know? Go check out the EEOC guidance on that. It tells you what you need to have in there. On top of that, take your practical experience, what's happened in the workplace, and think about, do I need to update my handbook based on that? Here's an example. We had a client. They had a report of harassment. They went to investigate it, and one of the employees said, I don't really want to cooperate. Do I have to cooperate? Because I'm going to just go ahead and decline to cooperate. Should you add a sentence or two to your policy that says cooperation in an investigation is a condition of employment? I like that. I think it makes it easier for employers to make sure that they're getting the information they need in an investigation. That's just one example. Doug talked about wage and hour policies. Some respects to that we covered, but even on the most basic level, think about, do we have a policy that says off the clock work not allowed, or it has to be tracked if you do anything outside of the workplace? If you're an hourly employee, it's got to be input into our timekeeping system. Little things like that can make a huge difference in a wage and hour claim. And I would say we're seeing a bit of an uptick in wage and hour claims right now. So do you have a wage and hour policy? So those are great tips from Jen and Doug. I'm going to add to the list, how about an AI policy? In the world that's changing and flexing, everywhere you turn, people are talking about the use of AI in the workplace. Do you want parameters on the extent to which your workforce can use AI to do their job? I would say that's very important. So think about an AI policy. How about the pandemic policy? That's another one we didn't used to see. We saw beginning in 2020, what happens if you don't have any kind of language in your handbook that addresses what can happen and what type of processes and protocols are triggered in a pandemic? Not saying we need 100% the extent of the COVID-19 pandemic language we were using, but perhaps some version of that to give you tools and resources if we face another pandemic. So those are all key things that I would say should be on your mind right now as you're looking into your policies and whether you need to update them. So let's talk about other issues related to handbooks. Like Jen, Doug, can you guys think of any other tips or pointers or things that go wrong that we've seen when employers don't have good handbook policies?
Well, confidentiality policy is another one that comes up to me. If it's not clear, what is the employer's information or what confidential information of clients or customers, what's going to happen with it? You mentioned an AI policy, that kind of goes hand in hand, right? If you're allowing the use of AI and your employees are just entering confidential information into a chat book that's going out into the ether, that's going to create an issue for you. We haven't seen a lot of that yet, but I think we're going to see more and more of that. What happens with employers' equipment when the employee leaves at the end of the employment term? What's going to happen with all that information that might be on their cell phone or their personal laptop or their personal email account? All those things should be addressed, and if they're not, things get messy.
I was going to tack onto that, and I don't think these are, well, I should say these policies I think are now pretty commonplace in handbooks, but like social media policies and policies on personal use of work equipment or work systems, right? So, a lot of policies will allow incidental use. You don't have to. Some people will say you can't use work related equipment or systems for any personal reasons. So, kind of what do you want your policies to be? Thinking through possible repercussions depending on the avenue that you choose. And if you're going to allow some kind of incidental use, what does that look like? Do you have a way of monitoring or telling it, if people are complying with the policy, what happens if people don't comply, right? All those things. And sometimes those policies can be very important if you are getting reports of something like harassment or bullying, especially if some of the conduct that's being complained of is happening in the social media world, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, Doug's point on the trade secrets, confidentiality, I couldn't agree more. We've heard us talk about how we have seen an uptick over probably the last 4 or 5 years on claims arising from situations where an employee takes all of the in-house, maybe customer list, maybe it's a price list, maybe it's the playbook, so to speak, of how the employer's doing business. A high-level employee leaves, takes that to a competitor, and uses it to basically cut against their former employer's competitive edge in the marketplace. If you have the right policies, it can mean everything in terms of being able to have a remedy for when that happens. For example, like Doug was saying, if you have a policy that lays out this is what we deem to be confidential, proprietary in-house information, and you're not allowed to take it and disclose it, that can go a long way if you need to seek some type of court relief if someone takes that information and tries to use it against the company or use it in a way that cuts against the company's revenues and profits. Savvy employers are going to have a confidentiality agreement, maybe non-solicitation, possibly even non-compete in limited situations. But that policy in your handbook, I would say there's still a lot of value to it because it says you're taking reasonable measures to protect what you think is confidential. So that is a very good reminder to definitely make sure you've got what you need there. I would note too that what we know from the EEOC, at least to a certain extent, from their reports that they kick out, is they have targeted some industries for prosecution of discrimination and harassment claims. And one of those is the construction industry. So we know that in 2024, that was an industry where the EEOC said we're going after construction companies that do not have the right policies and procedures in place. I would note that if you're in an industry like that one, where you are an enforcement priority, you better make sure you've got a handbook, that you're training on it, and you've got the right systems in place, or you're basically throwing away some of the most basic things that could protect your business. So think through that. Also, I would note manufacturing sectors, where you have big groups of perhaps employees in different protected classes, where you've got workplaces where there could be tension between different classes. All of those are ripe for claims, makes it even more important than ever to have the right policies and procedures in place. So I'm going to ask Jen and Doug, have you guys seen over the years handbooks where maybe the tone was wrong or the language was wrong? I mean, what do you think about funny handbooks or handbooks intended to be clever? Or have you seen other things that jumped out at you as being something employers should be on the lookout?
I think we've seen it time and again that employers will say, all these policies, it's too long. Nobody's ever going to read it. It should be really, really short. It should be brief. I mean, gosh, I've seen a handbook that was one page, and you just really cannot get the depth of information that you need in there. This is the playbook for how you're handling all your employment issues in your business. It needs to be detailed enough to actually make everything clear. And we've also seen ones where they're just, they have, we're thinking about one particular example where there's swear words in there. It's very, very flip and trying to be funny. I understand the impulse, but it really goes against what you're trying to achieve, which is kind of a serious document that shows what you're trying to do.
Well, I was thinking too, some employers will say, I think it's important to have a handbook, but I really don't want to spend any money on it. And I don't know where they went to get it, but I have seen handbooks where there are policies that are not legal. So, the only thing worse than having no handbook would be having a handbook that actually has policies that don't comply with the law, because that doesn't do you any good as an employer. And it actually makes you look like a very non-compliant employer because you have those policies. So, it's always good wherever you go to get your handbook, just to make sure that it's someone who knows what needs to be in there. And who can help you go through and make sure that at a bare minimum, the things that are in there are legally compliant, because you don't want to be telling your employees that you as an employer policy to do X, and then X is not actually something you as an employer legally can do.
We've also seen situations where I don't know if employers just pulled something off the internet, but it doesn't fit their business, and in fact, maybe obligates them to do things that they are not actually intending to do. We've seen that before, where the employer's like, well, wait, I have to do that? Well, you put it in your handbook, but nobody ever read it. Nobody ever reviewed it. Nobody ever tried to make sure that it mapped onto the business. So that's been a problem as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Those are good points. One would be, it's not a one-size-fits-all proposition. It can differ by size, by industry, by your benefits, or even the culture you're trying to build. So sometimes we'll get calls from employers saying, "Okay, we're starting a business. When do we need to get a handbook in place?" And when I get that question, I will say something like, "Well, it depends. If you're doing it for a strictly compliance perspective, then I would say as soon as you hit 5 employees, you need to get it in place, because while the federal anti-discrimination statutes might require employers to have more employees than that before they kick in Idaho, we have our Idaho Human Rights Act, which is triggered at 5 or more employees. So if you have 5 or more employees, you absolutely need to have a handbook in place. So that's one thing. And then, like Doug said, if you're a really big employer, you're clearly going to need different types of policies, different policy language. One of the things Doug touched on was, do you pay out accrued but unused PTO, for example, if an employee's terminated? I mean, that type of stuff should be thought through. Obviously, if you don't offer PTO, you probably don't want a policy that addresses that, right? And if you take someone else's handbook and copy it, you might end up with policies that don't have any bearing to what your actual workplace is like. I was just going to add too, what Doug was saying. The whole comment we sometimes hear by employers, which is that handbook's too long, I want something short and sweet. What I would say is, look, if you have a problem, there are certain policies you absolutely need to have. And if you're worried about your employees being able to understand it, the answer to that lies more with training, right? If you think the policies themselves, there's too many, it's too long, train your workforce on what those policies are in bite-sized chunks. If you roll out a new handbook, why couldn't you have a training session over a lunch hour or over a breakfast where you tackle maybe the 2 most important policies and give employees a chance to review them and ask questions about them? There are ways to roll a handbook out where you can train your employees what's in it and how they understand it and give them a chance to ask questions. I would say the answer is not just omitting policies that are applicable from your handbook. So that's your refresher for 2025. Time to take the handbook out, review it. Do you have the policies we've been talking about? Is it outdated? Like Jennifer said, we do see handbooks that have awful language in them. And the reason for that is frequently that the handbook just hasn't been reviewed in a really long time. Or like Doug said, maybe somebody got a template on the internet or something that isn't really applicable, but now's the time to make sure you've got what you need in place in case there's problems that come up. And what we also know from doing the handbook drafting and review is that getting your handbook in order can somewhat take some time. It's not always a super fast and easy process. So now's the time to get it on your calendar and make sure it happens. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us. Just a reminder, we have a book, Law for Leaders, that tracks the key things employers need to know to avoid claims and lawsuits. And we do training as well. Check out our website at lawforleaders.com. We're pretty passionate about keeping employers out of lawsuits. And the way to do that is through training. We offer virtual content, live content, and everything in between. So that's it for today. We'll see you next time on Ground Rules.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.